You've reached Stand Up, Fight Back, your author interview podcast. I'm your host, Chris. I want to introduce our guest today, but first, a quick reminder. As we wait now for the results of the grand jury investigation into the murders in Ferguson, folks across the country are organizing response actions. If you don't already know where your neighbors are going to gather to demonstrate against police violence after the grand jury releases its results, you can check out fergusonresponse.tumblr.com to find that location and meet up with them. Now, onto the show. Today, we welcome Gabriel Kuhn, author of Turning Money into Rebellion, The Unlikely Story of Denmark's Revolutionary Bank Robbers. This is the story of perhaps the most famous 20th century criminals in Denmark, a group of Marxists who stole millions of dollars and funneled the money to revolutionary socialist groups across the global south. It's a good interview and an interesting story, so stay tuned for that today, and you can get Gabriel's book at PM Press. I'm also happy to announce that the next episode will feature Emmanuel Ness, author of New Forms of Worker Organization, the Syndicalist Restoration of Class Struggle Unionism. It should be an interesting conversation about the resurgence of radical unionism across the world, and you can also get that book at PM Press. And links to both books are on the website, fightbackpodcast.com. But now, let's hear from Gabriel. Enjoy. Gabriel, who are and I hope I'm saying this right, Blekinge group, and why is there a book about them?
Okay. Don't worry too much about the pronunciation of the street. It's the name of a street in Denmark, so it's kind of flexible. I don't pronounce it right either. I don't pronounce it the Danish way, so I'll usually use the Swedish pronunciation, which is Blekinge. So the group that's named after this street and why that is the case we'll probably get to. It was a group of Danish Marxists, anti-imperialists, who from 1972 to 1988 did a series of robberies in Denmark. So they robbed post offices and cash in transit trucks and warehouses, and send all the money to Third World Liberation movements, mainly the PFLP, so the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And that was because the support of these movements was based on their revolutionary theory. So the socialist revolution, in their eyes, had to come from the Third World, and the subjects or protagonists of the revolution were these Third World revolution movements, Third World liberation movements. And the reason there is a book about it, I mean, there are actually a few books about it. This is the first one in English, is because I consider that history very interesting. It's a very unique chapter in the history of the anti-imperialist milieu in Europe and First World, the industrialized nations of the 1970s and 1980s. There are similarities to some other groups that were active at the time, but there are also some very unique features. And since there wasn't anything available in English, I thought it was a good idea to put a book together.
So this group got its start in the 1960s, right, as a group of anti-imperialists in the communist working circle. Can you tell us more about their beginnings and what their principles were?
Right. So the background of the what's called the Blekinge group lies in the 1960s. Now, when I say that the group existed from 1972, it is because this group that committed the robberies was an underground circle or an underground unit of an above-ground organization. So this above-ground organization was already founded in the 1960s, and it was called the Communist Working Circle. That's an English translation. It was founded by theorist who had been a member of the Danish Communist Party, but left in the early 1960s because of Maoist sympathies. So at the time, there was the beginning of the conflict between the Soviet Union and the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party. So this person, Gottfried Appel, sided with the Chinese line and was therefore excluded actually from the Danish Communist Party, which was loyal to Moscow. So this group, the Communist Working Circle, is often referred to as the first Maoist group in Europe. And already at the time, in the late 1960s, then there were problems between this organization and the Chinese Communist Party. So the Communist Working Circle stopped being an ally to Beijing and the Maoist Party, but that's a kind of side point. What's important is that this theory that the world revolution, so to speak, would have its origin in third world liberation movements was already developed by Gottfried Appel in the 1960s in the context of this organization. And the so-called illegal practice that would then give birth to the Blekinge Garde group was added in 1972.
So for a lot of us, especially folks who weren't around or politically active during that time, it seems a little bit strange to think about Maoism as something that a lot of people believed in. Could you maybe explain what the appeal of that political philosophy and of the political philosophy of this working group was to members and to the people who were really active in it?
Right. I mean, I think to begin with, the reason why ideologies such as Maoism or Marxism, Leninism in general is not as attractive perhaps to a contemporary generation of activists as it was to activists at the time, of course, has to do with the course of history. This is a long story, but the collapse of the Soviet Union has pretty much discredited, I guess, state socialist approaches in the eyes of many activists, including left-wing activists. So ideologies such as anarchism have become much more popular again. I think at the time, and I mean, I wasn't born in the 1960s either, so this is just from talking to people who were active at the time and from reading up on stuff. But it seems that a lot of people who were active politically, who were active on the left, still believed that those ideologies based on Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism, in a sense, is just an evolution of that, were able to bring about socialism and the world revolution. Plus, at the time, I mean, this wasn't just an abstract concept. You did have a lot of organizations, especially in the third world, arguably mass movements, struggle in the name of socialism and struggle against colonial rule and struggle against imperialism. So it doesn't, even if the ideology itself might not be so appealing to a lot of people today, at the time it was not only a more interesting ideology, but it was also directly related to very real concrete movements on the ground. And so even activists in first world countries or in industrialized nations, I guess, thought that by supporting those movements, they would make a contribution to the revolution that they were after.
So tell us a bit more about their belief that by supporting these revolutionary groups and goals in other countries, especially countries that they call the third world, they can bring about some sort of revolutionary movement for global socialism. Or why do they think that there's less possibility in Denmark or in Europe for a sort of Marxist or socialist revolution compared to Palestine or different countries in Africa or wherever?
Right. So this relates to one of the probably most unique feature in this particular group's theory and analysis, because they took what was a fairly common anti-imperialist analysis to the extreme, if you will, or they took it further than other groups, namely by concluding that the working classes of the industrialized nations did not play any role in the revolutionary process in the 1960s and 1970s, And so that differed to the opinion of a lot of other Marxist-Leninist organizations, both in the first world and the third world at the time, who still thought that the working classes, even in Europe in this case, or in Denmark, had a role to play. So this group, Gottfried Appel and the Communist Working Circle, thought that analysis was wrong, because in the context of the global capitalist system and the injustices that existed, the interests of the working class in the first world were actually closer to the interests of the capitalists than they were to the interests of the workers in the third world. And the reason was that because of the injustice in global exchange and the injustice created by the imperial system, the working classes in the first world actually did profit from global capitalism in terms of being able of getting a fair share, or not a fair share, but getting a share of the profits that were made by imperialist nations. So for them, a global revolution that would crush imperialism would actually entail a certain risk, like they might lose certain privileges in the global context. And so that's why they weren't interested in revolution. Now the theory was, and again, from today's perspective, this might all appear a little naive, but that was the theory at the time. So you had people struggling in the third world who did have an actual interest in revolution, who would win by bringing about socialism, or win something for themselves. So the idea was that once those revolutions in the third world would happen, then inevitably this would impact global imperialism. So imperialism would crumble, which would also mean that the profits that had come to the first world before would no longer come, which would intensify class struggles also in the first world again. So suddenly the working classes of the first world would no longer be able to profit from or benefit from the profits made by the imperialists, because there were no longer profits were no longer to be made. And so that would then intensify class struggle even in, say, Denmark, and so the working classes there would rise as well, and then there'd be socialism all over. So this was, in a nutshell, the revolutionary plan.
And they definitely went beyond just theorizing and writing about it, because in the early 1970s, they turned to non-legal action, including post office fraud and robbery of a transit truck with 500,000 crowns of cash in it. So like they turned to a lot of really radical direct action, to use the language of today, that
Right.
ended up stealing a huge amount of money, and then they decided to send that over to these groups that they wanted to directly support. So how did they
Right.
get started with this illegal action, and what was the impetus for them to do that?
Right. So I think it's, in a sense, it was very simple. So according to their analysis, so here they sit in Denmark, right? And they decide that, well, actually, there are no revolutionary forces in Denmark. All the revolutionary forces are in the third world. So what do you do if you want to support the revolution but you sit in Denmark? Well, you have to find a way to support those movements in the third world that are struggling for revolution there. So how do you best do that? You try to acquire some of the material means that are available to you as a citizen of the first world and send them there. Now they started, they did legal actions also. They started an organization called Toy til Afrika, Close to Africa, where they collected money at flea markets and in other ways, and then they would send that money to liberation movements as well. But they also realized that much more money could be made much faster by illegal action. And that's why this particular group within the Communist Working Circle in 1972 was established to acquire money by such means. And as you say, it started with, I would give 500,000 kroners, up to maybe 1 million kroners, and over the years they, I guess, got more experience and were willing to take higher risks and take on bigger jobs, and in the 1980s, Some of the robberies gave 7, 8, up to 13 million kroners, which is more than $1 million. So those were quite significant sums that they were then able to send to those organizations. And maybe I can add, I mean, how concretely did that happen? What we know is that it was an idea that the leadership of the Communist Working Circle, so that mainly meant Gottfried Appel, had, and there were some of the younger activists in the group who were willing to try that, and those younger activists were the ones that would then become the key members of the so-called Blekinge-Garde group.
So tell us a bit more about the Communist Working Circle and Appel and his leadership until eventually he and his wife left the group in 1978. How was it structured? What was their relationship with the Clothes for Africa project? That sort of thing.
Right. So I think, and I guess this might be offensive to some of the people who were part of this project, I don't know, but I think from today's perspective, it seems that the Communist Working Circle fit the picture that some people have of a Marxist-Leninist sectarian group fairly well. So it was a small group that wasn't even looking for mass membership, really. It was more of a cadre organization of dedicated revolutionaries that would be trained to be revolutionaries, that would be ready, that would support the revolution both by legal and illegal actions, and that would also be ready to take on a decisive role in the revolutionary struggle should it ever come to Denmark in this case. It was centered around a very charismatic leader, Gottfried Appel, who, from all I understand, pretty much was involved in all the decisions that were made by the group, who provided the main theoretical background. All this, as with many of such groups, led to internal conflicts which came to a head in 1977 and 1978. And this could be drawn out longer, but I'll try to make it short. That there was a conflict that centered around gender relations in the group. Now, some people say that it wasn't really about that. It was more about the personal power struggle, mainly between Gottfried Appel's partner, Ulla Houghton, and some of the younger activists who started to play a bigger and stronger role in the organization, and there was some conflict there. Whatever the reason might have been, the conflict led to the organization splitting basically into three groups. So one of them was Gottfried Appel and Ulla Houghton. They continued with the Communist Working Circle, but basically lost the entire membership. Then there was another group that tried to analyze what had gone wrong and develop a new theory and practice. And there was a third group, and that group included pretty much all of the younger activists who had been part of the illegal praxis, that is the Blekinge-Garde group, who wanted to continue with this praxis. And so they founded a new organization called the Communist Working Group, and they issued a journal called Manifest. So the group became known as Manifest Communist Working Group. And they, in a sense, continued the same theory and practice that they had done under the Communist Working Circle, only that certain changes occurred in the organization. So this charismatic central leading figure was gone. So I guess the new organization, which for short I'll call MKA, was more democratic. It was less dogmatic in its theory. I guess it was more open to debate with other parts of the left as well. So there were certain changes in that sense. But the basic anti-imperialist theory was the same, and the conclusion in terms of which practice would serve the revolution best was also the same. So basically that just continued despite the change of name. The Close to Africa project, for example, also continued, only that it was now affiliated with this new organization and no longer with the Communist Working Circle.
And when you say theory, it seems like, at least from the perspective of like my modern leftist politics, like I never really engage with things based on theories quite as seriously as it seems like these folks do. Like their theories seem so foundational, and also seem to maybe have caused splits over what seems like small disagreements, or from the outside at least seems like relatively small disagreements in the theories. For instance, they're split with the Communist Party of China over the differences in the belief of whether or not Europe has any revolutionary potential. That's a very foreign kind of concept to me. Can you explain more about why, or you know, what that meant for them and how their theories were so foundational to their practice?
Yeah, I think again, I mean, as I said, I wasn't born in the 1960s either. I wasn't politically active in the 1970s, so I have a similar initial feeling, like, okay, this was a lot of very small things. Apparently small things seemed very big, and it was kind of petty infighting and all of that. And partly that's certainly true. Now, I think there's a difference, though, between focusing solely on theory and then calling that political action or whatever, and then having disagreements with other people who solely focus on theory. And that, I think, whether that happened in the 1970s or today, can really become rather boring. I think with a group like in this case, who tries to relate its theory to a very concrete practice, seemingly small theoretical differences can have a big impact. Let's say, for example, you're an organization that actually has a close relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, in very practical terms, that gives you access to certain people, to information, it gives you resources and all of that. So then if some difference in theory occurs that would, for example, make the Chinese Communist Party decide that it no longer supports you, that it no longer sees you as an ally, then that would have an impact on your organization and the way you can work. And so it's not just some kind of petty theoretical stuff that's not really relevant. It's something that becomes very relevant in your daily political practice. And so I think if you're active in a context where you deal with such powerful organizations and where there are these splits in the left-wing movement, that, again, might seem petty, but that can have significant practical consequences for you, then all that stuff becomes relevant whether you like it or not. I don't think we have a situation today where we're dealing with this. I mean, there are no, for better or worse, there are no leftist ideologies or organizations that have a huge impact on global politics today. And so these kind of petty theoretical problems might appear very petty because they are not related to any political practice. But if I try to put myself into a situation of the 1960s and 70s, I think I can understand why those things would be more relevant.
Or could you talk about the groups that they supported and what their political practice was, what their theories were, and how they got into contact with them and got the money to them?
Right. So as I said, the PFLP in Palestine was very central. The main reason, I think, why that organization was so central was not necessarily because the Palestinian struggle in itself was a key struggle, but because at the time in the late 1960s, it emerged as both a very central struggle for the global anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle, led by an organization, the PFLP, who appeared to be very advanced in its, again, socialist and revolutionary theory, and which was also able to provide, for example, training centers, training camps for revolutionaries from all over the world. So this was partly a strategic decision to establish particularly close ties to the PFLP. The other movements they supported were mainly in southern Africa. So this was SWAPO in Namibia, the MPLA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique. So those were organizations that at the time were still, these were still colonized countries at the time. So this was, I guess today you would say, primarily an anti-colonial struggle. So this was about the country's independence. But it was also fought the struggles were also fought in the name of socialism. So not only would you liberate your country, you would also turn your country into a socialist state. Now, as history has shown, even though most of those liberation movements were successful, the countries they liberated did not turn, again, for better or worse, did not turn into socialist states. So the whole, and the PFLP itself, I guess, in its role to advance global socialism, the role that the organization played became weaker and weaker because of all sorts of internal and external circumstances. So arguably, and I think the members of the Blekinge group would say the same, and others who were active at the time, that the socialist aspect of those liberation movements maybe was overestimated at the time. So the nationalist, the national liberation aspect might have always overpowered the socialist aspirations. But at the time, I suppose, that wasn't clear to a lot of people, maybe not even the ones fighting in those organizations themselves.
And so we're talking about millions of dollars or millions of crowns being sent to these organizations, especially in Palestine. And so how did they actually get that money there?
Yeah, this is this is something that involves a lot of people. So this is not something that many people want to talk about too much either. But I guess there were couriers who carried the money somewhere. It was picked up by someone else, and then it was transported to third and fourth party. I think it was just you can imagine some kind of clandestine network of people carrying a lot of money around between Europe and the Middle East and Africa.
One of the things that the group or the members of the group whose words appear in your book said was that a lot of the agents or the representatives of these groups in Europe maybe didn't have the best security practices. That was one of their complaints, especially about the folks from the Europeans who were supporting the Palestinian liberation groups. So it sounds like there are just these huge, or I don't know if they're huge, but there were these networks of supporters and agents really operating in Europe, which is a very high stakes way to do it.
Right. Yeah, security culture, it's a big issue in contemporary activist movements, and it was a big issue at the time, arguably because of the actions that were undertaken at the time, and the significance of a lot of the struggles that they related to. It might have even been bigger, and the risks that were taken, it might have even been a bigger issue. So for the Blekinge group, for example, and that concerned both their activities in Denmark, but also their visits to the Middle East and Africa, for example. Security culture was very important, and I think for them, in order to minimize the risks, they minimized the contacts they had to people as much as possible. So really focusing on the few people that you need to be in touch with, that you need to be in contact with, that you can be as sure as you can be, that you can be sure of as being reliable. and trying to avoid unnecessary contacts with other people who, you have no guarantee where they're coming from and what their agenda really is. So I think obviously whatever their exact approach was, the fact that they were able to do this for 16 years indicates that their security culture was in fact very advanced.
And one of the revelations of the book is that it seems throughout, or at different points throughout their illegal activities, they were under surveillance by the Danish state and different Danish police departments, and people had some idea within the state that these people are up to something, but yet they still were able to keep on going for 16 years. And it seems like if they hadn't made a couple of mistakes, and if some things hadn't gone terribly wrong for them in the last year of their existence before their capture, they could have kept on going maybe forever.
Yeah, I don't know forever, but probably a bit longer. I mean, the issue of the Danish police, the role that the Danish police in all this played in all this, is still very big, and it's still a big issue in Denmark to this day. So specifically, the question concerns PET. PET is basically the Danish secret police. Now, what we know is that PET had observed these activists since the early 1970s. Now, it is not quite clear why that observation started, but it probably only started because they were part of the Communist Working Circle, which was considered to be perhaps not a dangerous but a group that PET, the secret police, wanted to keep its eye on. So it's not clear if they actually knew about the illegal activities. And in fact, to this day, it is not clear if the secret police ever figured out during this observation throughout the 1970s and the 1980s that the group members or some of the group members were actually involved in illegal activities. Now, it is true that it seems strange that if it's this, I mean, they're not amateurs, so they observe this group for a long time, for many, many years. During this time, they commit some of the most spectacular robberies in Denmark ever, and then the secret police wouldn't know about this. But, I mean, the bottom line is that there are only two possible answers to this. Either they really didn't do a good job and just never saw that connection and never understood that connection, or they did know about it but didn't want to interfere, perhaps because they were hoping that at some point in the future this group would lead them to some big-name Palestinian terrorists or whatever. So, I mean, this is not different from a lot of, undercover agents who infiltrate groups and then they wait till the most spectacular moment to actually arrest them or whatever. So that might have been another possibility, which, as I said, Danish society to this day tries to figure out itself. So I think there have been 3 government commissions up to this point where experts were asked to look into PET's role in relation to the Blekinge-Gata group and to really disclose what was going on. None of those commissions really came up with any substantial results. So this is still a big question mark and mystery, in fact, also to the Danish public, which is one of the reasons why the story of the Blekinge-Gata group remains a topic that comes up in Danish media repeatedly to this day.
And so you wrote that a book published by a journalist about this group was the #1 bestseller in the country. This is something that really does, it seems, capture a lot of attention in Denmark, and also a lot of their, sort of thoughts and hopes, maybe, in some ways. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the public reaction to this disclosure was, and and how that sort of related to the people who are actually involved in it?
Right. I mean, the story, yes, and for Danish society, I mean, you gotta understand also that Denmark's a fairly small country. So a group being if a group is unveiled that was responsible for some of the, as I said before, some of the most spectacular robberies in the country's history, and then it becomes obvious that this group was actually connected to a political organization, was doing all this with a political intention, and the whole theory behind it that I said before. Obviously, that will arouse interest in this country, in Danish society. Plus, as I said, there's a lot of question marks attached to the story about the role of the secret police, for example. Plus, the way that the people got arrested was very spectacular and dramatic, and so it's a very good story. So it's become part of, I guess, Danish. I wouldn't say popular culture, but of Danish history, late 20th century Danish history. Now, obviously, that has impacted the people who were involved in this. I mean, the media attention that they got in Denmark was huge, and as so often, the media coverage was very sensationalist. So it mainly focused on the robberies and the criminal activities, and the victims of the robberies, and then supposed connections to an international terrorist network, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, this is more interesting for daily papers than anti-imperialist theory. And so I think for the former members of the group, dealing with that kind of attention and also dealing with Danish journalists and their particular interests was tiring, to say the least. And I think, to be honest, that worked to my advantage when I wanted to do this book, because I'm not Danish, and I wanted to look mainly at the politics, and I wanted to do that also from an international angle and bring out the story to an international audience. And I think that to them was way more interesting than dealing with yet another Danish journalist who was mainly interested in other things. Like, for example, you mentioned this book by Peter Ulrik Knudsen, which is a 2-volume, almost 1,000-page story, account of this story, and with one exception, none of the former group members wanted to talk to this particular journalist, which also meant that their voices and their perspectives are missing in this book, which in turn became another motivation for me to do the book I did, because the book, the biggest part of the book is a long interview with 2 of the former key members. So they provide perspectives which have been lacking in covering the group and the group's history, basically since they got out of jail 20 years ago, out of prison. So that's basically the role of the group and the story in Denmark, and the way it's impacted the members.
So what was their final action, and how did they get caught?
Yeah, so in November 1988, they decided to rob a cash-in-transit truck in the yard of the central post office in Copenhagen, in the center of Copenhagen. And they got away with 13 million kroners, which was the biggest amount of money they had ever made in a single robbery. And now, unfortunately, what happened was that just as they were driving away, 2 police cars had already arrived at the scene. They were able to drive past one of them and then decided to stop in front of the other to fire a warning shot, hoping that would lead to the second police car not chasing them. So as they fired the shot, one of the there were two policemen in the police car. One of them got out just at that very moment and got hit and died. So this was the first time ever that someone died at any of their robberies. People have been injured before, but no one even seriously. Which obviously, that in combination with the big amount of money caused also the secret police to, for the first time, really get involved in clearing up this incident. So for the first time ever, the secret police joined up with the Copenhagen Police Department in order to solve this particular robbery. And it was because of this collaboration, essentially, that the members of the group were finally arrested. And so this was, though this still took a few months, so they were arrested about half a year after this particular robbery.
And so they were arrested, but the state didn't necessarily have a lot of evidence against them. So how did they go about getting evidence, and what actually led to them ultimately being convicted of at least some of the charges?
Right. So this is part of where the story becomes a very good story. So the key members are arrested. It is true that there are more arrested because some of the leading investigators have a feeling that it is them. They don't have any hard evidence. So they arrest them and basically get a judge in Copenhagen to allow them to keep the folks in jail for 3 weeks. And if the police during those 3 weeks was not able to produce a strong case, then they would have to be released. Despite the arrest, so the police arrest those folks and they go to their homes and their workplaces and do big searches and nothing comes up. So they're still without hard evidence. The strongest lead that they have is a set of keys that three of the members had with them. So identical set of keys that all of them had. That looked like keys that would lead to an apartment in Copenhagen, but it's not clear and no one tells the police what the keys are for. So for weeks they send out dozens of policemen to look for an apartment with a lock that fits those keys, so they don't find anything. Now, one day before those 3 weeks are over, so one day before, according to the order by the judge, they would have to be released. A patrol car north of Copenhagen gets called in the early morning to a traffic accident, which looks like a fairly normal traffic accident. But when they get there and search the car, they find a lot of money there in different currencies. They find wigs, tools that look like tools that criminals use, not handymen. And when they identify the driver who is severely injured, when they identify the driver, they see that the driver is the only member of this group that they were still looking for. So they had his name, but they hadn't been able to arrest him when they arrested the others. This man also has these keys on them, the same keys that the other people have that are still, whose purpose is still unknown. Plus, when they look through the car, they find, among a whole bunch of other papers, they find a telephone bill for a telephone that is registered at an apartment in Copenhagen in Blekingegade, the street. So the police drives to that street address, Blekingegade 2, uses these keys, opens the door, and finds what one of the policemen called an El Dorado for a policeman, which basically meant that once they entered it was obvious that that apartment had been used as a place to coordinate all sorts of illegal activities, robberies, falsifying documents. They also find the biggest illegal weapons stash they had ever found in Denmark. So from having basically no evidence, they went within one morning to having a huge amount of evidence. And so they take 7 former group members to court, who then receive sentences between 1 and 10 years in prison, which seems low for the activities they were accused of, even for Danish standards, definitely for U.S. standards. But there were several reasons for this, why they got off fairly lightly. And I mean, the trial itself could be analyzed for hours, but I mean, basically the police and the prosecution just didn't do a very good job. And plus, there was certain evidence that was still lacking. For example, no one got convicted for the death of the policeman at the last robbery because it wasn't able to clarify who fired the shot. And it was also clear, given all the evidence that existed, that the shot was not fired to kill or harm anyone. The shot was fired to deter the police car from following the robbers. So they did not get a sentence for that. They got convicted for some of the robberies. But yeah, the sentences were relatively low.
And so in that apartment, there were maybe 2 things that grabbed a lot of attention. One was the surfboards with missiles inside of them. And then the second was what the media called the Jew file or the Zionism file. Can you talk about those 2 things?
Right. So the weapons were there because in the early 1980s, when Israel invaded Lebanon, the PFLP headquarters were there, and they were basically destroyed, and also most of the weapons that the PFLP had were destroyed or confiscated or disappeared. Anyway, the PFLP did no longer have them. So at that point, they were desperately in need of new weapons, and the Blekinge group decided that they would help, and so they went to Sweden, and they robbed weapons from weapons depot of the Swedish army and took them to Copenhagen. Now, the problem was that what we were talking about how to transport money before, I guess that works with suitcases and other devices. It is much easier to transport missiles. So basically, they were stuck with those weapons in Copenhagen. Some of them they were able at one stage to transport to France, and then they buried them in the woods near Paris, and they gave that information to some of their contacts, and so I guess some of those weapons got picked up. No one even really knows. But most of the weapons stayed in Copenhagen for years and years, and they didn't know what to do with them. And so when the police found the apartment, they were still there. So that's the story of the weapons. The so-called Jew file, which otherwise is referred to as Z files, Z for Zionism, was a file basically that they started to compile in, or more concretely, a bunch of different files. They started to compile in the early 1980s when the PFLP started to have more and more problems with supposed allies and sympathizers coming from Europe that might in fact have been agents for some of the security agencies of different countries. And so by asking the Blekinge group to gather more information about possible agents, the PFLP thought that the Blekinge group could do them a favor, and so they started to compile this file. And essentially, what happened is that they were looking a lot at people who were active in Denmark supporting the state of Israel, and added names of individuals and organizations and projects to their file that were active in the support of Israel. And a fair amount of those people and organizations and projects were Jewish. So the majority of folks in that file were Jewish, and that's why it was dubbed the Jew file by the media. And of course that caused discussions about the Israel-Palestine situation, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and it was something that caused a lot of stir also in Danish society. Also because, as I said, there were some individuals on that list who, when the list was discovered, had no idea what that was. I mean, in their eyes, it might have been a death list or whatever. So I guess it's understandable that this list caused a lot of stir in the public eye.
So a lot of the book is the members of the Blekinge Gata group talking about their motivations and also setting the record straight in a lot of ways. Could you talk maybe about some of the misconceptions that they wanted to, clear up?
Right. I think one of the key factors is that the explanation, that the motivation for their actions, it was always presented. Of course, people are always talking about the political motivations behind their actions, but never really in that depth, I guess, that they would have wanted the public to understand. So I guess this is one motivation, but another one clearly was that certain connections that people had suggested existed over the years between them and other groups active at the time, particularly the Red Army faction in Germany, or, for example, the infamous Carlos, known as an international terrorist, and also connections to Wadi Haddad, who was one of the early PFLP key members, who was then responsible for organizing hijackings of planes and other spectacular international actions. That those connections didn't exist in the way that was presented or suggested by a lot of other journalists, also by Peter Ulrik Knudsen in his very popular book. So I think this was one of the more concrete things. Plus, I mean, there are certain suggestions in the book, also by Knudsen, for example, that other people have picked up about some robberies that they might have committed, which they actually didn't commit. So there are some of those sort of details. But I think the main one is the supposed connections to this international terror network, as it is often called. And I mean, it's not about them distancing themselves from other group in any kind of moral sense that they want to portray themselves to be better than the Red Army faction was. So it's not about that. It's just because of maybe what we were talking about before, even though to some people today the differences between the Blekinge Gata group's theoretical approach and the Red Army faction's theoretical approach might not seem so important. But for them at the time, they were very important. So I guess if your identity was very much tied to having your own political line and not having the political line of, for example, the Red Army faction, you'd also want people who write your history to acknowledge that and not just throw different groups into one and the same pot. So I think it was mainly that. It was having the opportunity to really explain the politics, and also through explaining the politics, making clear which connections to other groups and movements existed both theoretically and practically, and which actually did not exist.
So these people got convicted and sentenced to, you said between 1 and 10 years, and so they were also some of them were active in political struggles in prison. Can you tell us more about that?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the way that one of the members in the interview puts it was that, well, I'm paraphrasing a little, but we were always active as communists, so we were active as communists in prison as well. So finding themselves in a situation that entails a lot of injustice, I guess as a political activist, or I guess in their words, as a communist activist, your instant reaction is to try to do something against that and try to correct some of the wrongs. And so they were active in different ways. One of them was an editor for Prisoners magazine. They were involved in campaigns against, for example, the overcharging of prisoners at prison stores. Very often there'd only be one store that had a monopoly on selling a lot of products and would sell them at very high prices. So they organized strikes and collective action against such measures. They were active also. They contributed to getting information out about isolation in Danish prisons, which was strong at the time, so people would be kept in isolated cells almost 24 hours a day for weeks on end. And so they used their time basically in prison, again, as they themselves described it, to analyze the power struggles there, and just as they did as political prisoners as political activists on the outside, and analyze the situation and the power relations and draw certain conclusions about how to improve the situation, and then start certain actions and activities that would help with that. So that's what they did.
And they rejected the label of political prisoner, in part because they never issued political communiques or really claimed any of the robberies that they did commit, and also in part because they felt like they weren't attacking the Danish state, but supporting states elsewhere. They were just common criminals within Denmark, or at least more similar to that than to any sort of political prisoner label.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting part, actually, of the history of the group, also especially for people who have an interest or are involved in the prison struggles, is that they rejected that label for themselves because they felt that in the context of Danish society, it didn't fit. And once again, this was not just some kind of random, petty, theoretical decision, but I guess it was coherent with their political practice, because since they had decided that there wasn't a revolutionary situation in Denmark, they wouldn't get involved in a revolutionary struggle in Denmark. What they would do is to be criminals in Denmark in order to support revolutionary struggles elsewhere. Now, obviously, there's a political connection or a political motivation, but in the context of Danish society, they robbed post offices. They didn't attack the state, or they didn't attack any other political institutions and such. So there was nothing in the sense when they were in prison that divided them, or the reasons for them being there in terms of their concrete actions, from the reasons of other inmates. And so they saw themselves as part of the overall prison population, and didn't want to distinguish themselves from other prisoners by using different labels. And also, so their activism was related to the concrete situation of all inmates in prison. While, for example, if you look at the situation in Germany with Red Army faction prisoners, they were also politically active in prison, but their activism in prison was a continuation of their struggle against the German state outside. And this is what the Blekinge-Garde group members would say as well. For Red Army factionists in Germany, it made perfect sense to claim the status of political prisoner because they were in German prisons as a consequence of a struggle against the German state, and so their activism in prison was a continuation of that struggle, which wasn't the case, again, for them in Denmark. Now, if you spin this even further, as they also say, if, for example, let's say they would have been arrested in Israel and ended up in an Israeli prison, then they might have chosen a different status because their role as supporters of the PFLP in the Middle East was a different one than their role as robbers in Denmark.
So is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about their story or about their principles and their politics?
I think we covered pretty good ground. I mean, what I might want to add is that I think the the story, which is told in the book, is not just interesting as a historical document. That alone, I mean, yeah, you want to, I guess, can it be enough motivation to give out a book because you cover a good story? I guess it can, but I had other motivations with this as well, because I think that certain implications of the story are very relevant even for contemporary activists. And if I can sum that up real quick, I think it'd be mainly three aspects. One is the internationalism that's connected to the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial history. I think this is a very weak point in the left, whether it is Marxist or anarchist or whatever, today, that internationalist perspective has been lost, and with that also an infrastructure that would allow for effective internationalist action. I think most recently we've seen this in relation to Kurdistan, for example, where most of the solidarity actions have been mainly symbolic, if they happened at all, because there is no real infrastructure to support the struggles happening there more concretely for activists in other parts of the world. And I think if you look at, again, regardless of what you think about the ideological overtones, but if you look at the infrastructure and also the dedication of activists that existed at the time for internationalist struggles, I think that's a very important aspect that reminds us of important discussions that we need to have today. So that's one aspect. Another one actually is this belief in revolution. As I said before, I mean, it's very easy to sit here today and look at their concept of revolution and kind of, laugh about it. I think that was really naive. But what is the answer if you yourself don't have any concept of revolution, really, but still call yourself a revolutionary? I mean, a lot of the more radical movements in the left still like to use that term, being revolutionary, to distinguish yourself from moderates and liberals and reformists and such. But sometimes it's a fairly empty phrase, because it seems to me that it's hard for a lot of us to explain what we really mean by that. What is revolutionary politics, and what actually is the revolutionary goal, and what does a revolution look like? And so again, these stories from the 1970s and 80s, or this particular story of the Blekinge-Garde group, I think can remind us of the importance of discussing such questions. And the third aspect, I think, relates to political organizing. Again, this is a big issue, and that there are definitely discussions that are happening. But again, it is very easy to call these more if we want to say sectarian, dogmatic, authoritarian structures that some people used for their political organizing in the 1970s and 80s for outdated and no longer relevant or even dangerous or whatever. But at the same time, if we ourselves don't come up with other forms of organizing that are more effective than just being able to cover the next short-term campaign, but that are actually able to allow for also more strategic thinking, long-term work, a connection between theory and practice, then I think it's no longer so easy to just laugh off former attempts. So again, I don't think there's anyone who says that, well, we need to copy these models. But I think if you actually don't laugh at these models, but you look at them and you look at, all right, well, so what was really bad and what was maybe not so bad, and is there anything that could inspire current forms of organizing? I think we could still learn from those from those histories as well. So those aspects, I think, were important for me in making this book. And so if you give me the opportunity to share them on air as well, I'll do so.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed hearing from you and hearing this story, and also, especially hearing how it can engage with